12 hours before the anniversary trip my husband and I had waited 5 years to take. My son Daniel called and said, "Marissa needs you to watch the kids." Not asked, not apologized, just decided. Then came the message that finally opened my eyes. Don't be selfish. Family comes first. Cancel your trip. But what Daniel didn't know was that I had just found the old text proving they had known about this problem for 2 weeks. They hadn't run out of time. They had simply waited, assuming I would give up mine. So I looked at my packed suitcase and said one word: no. That night taught me something I should have learned years earlier. Family is love, but it is not ownership. I was less than 12 hours away from leaving when everything shifted. There were 2 open suitcases on the floor in front of me. One already zipped, the other half full. The printed itinerary for our anniversary trip to Italy sat on the dresser beside my passport. My husband, Robert, had printed it twice because he still liked holding paper in his hands when something mattered. We had saved for 5 years for this trip, putting it off more than once, telling ourselves we would go when things settled down. The flights, hotels, and tours had already been paid for. Canceling now would mean losing nearly $3,000. This time, we didn't postpone. My phone rang just as I was folding the last shirt. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I saw my son Daniel's name and answered. "Marissa needs you to watch the kids." There was no greeting, no pause, nothing that sounded like a question. I stood there holding the phone, looking at the tickets on the dresser, trying to place what I had just heard. "Our flight is in the morning," I said. He didn't respond to that directly. "It's just for the week," he said, like it was something simple, already decided. I didn't answer right away. I could hear my husband moving in the hallway, checking the bags, going over things the way he always does before we leave. Everything about the evening had been steady until that moment. A message came through before I spoke again. Don't be selfish. Family comes first. Cancel your trip. I read it once, then again. Not because I didn't understand it, but because of how quickly it had been said. It wasn't a request. It was a correction, as if I had already done something wrong by not agreeing immediately. I set the shirt down on the bed and sat for a moment, the phone still in my hand. I didn't feel angry. If anything, I felt something quieter, like I had seen this before and just hadn't named it. I didn't feel rushed. I just saw the situation clearly in a way I hadn't before. My name is Naomi Whitaker. I am 62 years old. I have lived in Sacramento most of my life, long enough to know how things tend to settle into patterns without anyone noticing. This one had been in place for longer than I realized. I lifted the phone back to my ear. "No," I said. There was a pause, quiet but heavy, like something had been interrupted. I stayed where I was, looking at the suitcase, listening to the silence on the other end of the line. My husband stepped into the doorway then, not asking anything, just waiting. I ended the call and set the phone down. This wasn't about helping. It never was. After I ended the call, I opened our recent texts. It didn't take long to find what I needed. 2 weeks earlier, Marissa had mentioned her training schedule, including the full days she would be away. After that, there had been no follow-up, no request, and no real attempt to arrange childcare. They had waited. That part became clear in a way it hadn't before. They hadn't run out of time. They had chosen not to use it. I looked at the suitcase again. Don't be selfish. Family comes first. Now it felt less like pressure and more like confirmation. This wasn't sudden. They knew their schedule, knew the cost of other options, and assumed I would adjust mine. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was recognition. They hadn't asked because they didn't think they needed to. He called again, not long after. Before I had a chance to close the suitcase. "It's just a week," he said, as if repeating it would make it smaller, easier to agree to. I stood there with my hand on the bed and looked at the open space in the suitcase. I could hear movement on his end, a door closing, something being set down, the sound of a life continuing as if the outcome of this conversation had already been decided. "It doesn't have to be complicated," he added, his voice tightening slightly. "You can move your trip. This matters more." I picked up my phone and held it closer. Not because I needed to hear him better, but because I wanted to answer clearly. "No," I said. He waited for the explanation that usually came after. I didn't give him one. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I stayed quiet. The conversation lost its direction the moment I stopped filling the silence for him. He exhaled, sharper this time, and the call ended without anything else being said. I set the phone down again and reached for the suitcase, closing it with a steady motion, as if nothing had changed, even though something clearly had. 10 minutes later, Daniel called again. His voice was lower this time, less forceful, more careful, as if he had stepped into another room and decided a different approach might work better. "We've been dealing with a lot lately," he said. "The mortgage went up. Everything costs more now, and we're trying to keep things under control." I listened without interrupting, leaning against the dresser, my eyes drifting toward the itinerary again, still sitting where I had left it. "Overnight, childcare isn't cheap," he continued. "We checked. The sitter wants $400 a night, and that doesn't even include the extra hours before Marissa leaves for training. It's more than we can manage right now." There it was, laid out plainly. The way he said it stayed with me longer than anything else. "This would help us a lot," he added, softer now, as if that made it different. I nodded once, even though he couldn't see it. "I understand," I said. "But I'm still not canceling my trip." There was a pause, not as sharp as before, but heavier in a different way. Like the conversation had shifted from expectation to negotiation. "You know we wouldn't ask if it wasn't important," he said. I let that sit for a moment. For the first time, I heard how often important simply meant what they needed, not what I had already committed to. "I'm sure it is," I said. "But this isn't something I can take on." I could feel the distance between us growing. Not dramatic, not sudden, just steady and clear, like something that had been assumed was now being reconsidered. The next call came from Daniel. But I could hear Marissa's frustration behind his words. "You're their grandmother," he said. "You've always helped. Why is this different?" I stayed where I was, standing beside the bed, one hand resting on the closed suitcase, and let him continue. "They need you," he added. "We need you. Family comes first." The words were familiar, not because they were said often, but because of how easily they were used, like they carried their own authority and didn't need to be explained. "I've already told you," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm not canceling my trip." There was a brief silence, and then something shifted. "Fine," he said, quieter now, but not calmer. "Just remember this when you need something from us later." It landed differently than everything else he had said. Not louder, not more emotional, but sharper in its intention. I thought about that for a moment. It wasn't about helping anymore. It was about keeping score. "I'm not asking for anything right now," I said. "That's not the point." He replied, "It will be." The conversation had moved quickly from what they needed to what they believed I owed. I looked toward the doorway, where my husband had passed through earlier, and then back at the phone in my hand. "I'm still not changing my plans," I said. There wasn't an argument after that. No raised voices. No attempt to soften what had been said. He ended the call without another word. And the silence that followed felt different from before, less uncertain, more settled, like something had been stated plainly and couldn't be taken back. He called again, not long after, and this time I answered without hesitation. There was no pause on his end. "So that's it," he said. "You're just going to leave us to deal with this on our own." I stood near the dresser, my hand resting lightly on the edge, and kept my voice steady. "Yes," I said, "that's what I'm doing." "That's unbelievable," he replied, the control in his tone starting to slip. "We told you what's going on. You know we don't have another option right now." I let him finish before I spoke again. "You do have options," I said. "You just don't like them." There was a short, sharp exhale on the other end of the line, the kind that comes when something doesn't land the way it's supposed to. "You're really going to stand there and say that?" he said. "I'm standing here saying this," I replied, keeping my words measured. "Your lack of planning is not my responsibility." The silence that followed was heavier than before, not uncertain this time, but resistant, like he was trying to push back against something that wasn't moving. "That's not fair," he said. "Louder now. We're asking for help, not handing you a burden. You're not asking—" I said. "You decided, and now you're telling me to agree." That seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. His voice rose slightly, then dropped again, as if he couldn't settle on how to respond. "You've never had a problem helping before," he said. "I know," I answered. "That doesn't mean I don't get to decide now." From his silence, I could tell the idea sounded almost unfamiliar to him. There was a shift then, not in what he was saying, but in how he was saying it. The frustration no longer controlled, the expectation no longer certain. "So that's it?" he asked again, but this time it sounded different, less like a challenge and more like he was trying to understand something that didn't fit. "That's it," I said. I didn't add anything else. And when the call ended, I didn't pick the conversation back up. The messages started coming in not long after the last call ended. I was still in the bedroom, going through the last few things we needed to bring, when my phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a string of texts, one after another, each one more urgent than the last. "The sitter wants $800 for the first 2 nights. Her schedule doesn't match what we need. Marissa might miss the first day of training if we can't fix this." I read them as they came in, not rushing, not reacting, just taking them in one at a time. The tone was different now. It wasn't about what I should do anymore. It was about what they were dealing with. A few minutes later, another message appeared. This one from my daughter-in-law. She didn't call. She just wrote. Shorter sentences, less controlled. "We're trying to figure it out." There was no accusation in that message, just strain. I set the phone down on the bed and looked at it for a moment before turning back to the suitcase. My husband walked past the doorway again, carrying one of the smaller bags, and paused briefly when he saw me standing there. "Everything all right?" he asked. "It will be," I said. For once, I believed it when I said it. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't pick it up right away. Whatever was happening on their side was still moving forward, whether I stepped into it or not. For the first time, I could see it clearly. They weren't waiting for me to decide anymore. They were trying to solve it without me. We were about to leave for the airport when my phone rang again. My suitcase was already by the door, my husband waiting outside with the car running. And for a moment, I considered letting it go. The screen showed Daniel's name, steady and familiar, like nothing had changed between us. I answered, "If you get on that plane, don't call us again." There was no lead-up this time, no attempt to explain or persuade, just a line drawn, clear and final. I stood with my hand on the suitcase handle. I didn't answer right away. I could hear him breathing, waiting for a reaction. It would have been easy to give him one, to say I would call around and fix it. But I didn't. If that's what it comes down to, I said, then maybe this week will teach us both something. The words came out steady, without hesitation. And once they were said, there wasn't anything left to add. He didn't respond. The line stayed open for a second longer, and then it went quiet. I lowered the phone and stood there for a moment, not moving, just letting the silence settle into something real. Outside, I could hear the low hum of the engine, the soft closing of the car door as my husband adjusted something in the trunk. I turned the phone over in my hand and pressed the button, watching the screen go dark. The moment the screen went dark, the pressure stopped with it. I picked up my suitcase, opened the door, and stepped outside. The air was cooler than I expected, just enough to make me pause for a second before walking toward the car. We didn't wait 5 years to turn around now, he said quietly. My husband didn't ask anything as I got in. He just looked at me once, briefly, then pulled away from the curb. I leaned back in my seat, my phone quiet beside me, and watched the street fall behind us as we drove toward the airport. When we landed, I turned my phone back on as we waited for the seatbelt sign to go off. The messages came through all at once, stacking over each other in a way that made it clear they hadn't slowed down while I was gone. I didn't open them right away. I just watched the screen fill, then stood to reach for my bag when it was time. It wasn't until we were outside, waiting for the shuttle to the rental lot, that I started reading. They had found someone to stay overnight, but the cost had doubled from what they expected. By the time they paid the sitter, changed work hours, and covered the last-minute gap, the problem they had tried to hand to me had become their own expensive lesson. There were messages about adjusting schedules, about calls made and returned, about trying to make everything fit into something that hadn't been planned properly to begin with. From the way the messages were written, I could tell it hadn't gone smoothly. The sitter had arrived late, and my son had to stay home longer than planned before leaving for work. My daughter-in-law had missed the first part of her training entirely. There was no explanation attached to it, just the fact, stated plainly. I kept scrolling. Then I saw a shorter message, sent later than the others. One of the kids asked, "Why you didn't come?" There was nothing after that. No follow-up. No attempt to answer it in the message itself. I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand, the sound of the shuttle pulling up behind me, doors opening and closing as people stepped on. My husband took my bag without saying anything and waited for me to move. I read the messages again, not searching for something new, just seeing them differently now that I was no longer part of the situation they described. Nothing had collapsed. They hadn't been left without options. It had been difficult, more expensive, more inconvenient than they wanted, but it had been handled. That reality looked nothing like the emergency they had tried to place on my shoulders. I locked my phone and slipped it into my bag before stepping onto the shuttle beside him. When we got home, nothing dramatic happened. There was no confrontation waiting for me, no immediate attempt to revisit what had been said. The house felt the same as we had left it, quiet and steady. And for a while, that was enough. We spoke a few days later, briefly and without much detail. He told me they had worked it out, that things had been difficult but manageable. I didn't ask for specifics, and he didn't offer them. The conversation stayed on the surface, practical and contained. Like we both understood there were parts of it that didn't need to be argued again. After that, I made a few changes. I updated my emergency contact information, removing assumptions that had been in place for years without being questioned. I reviewed my financial accounts and made sure everything was arranged the way I wanted, with clear boundaries about access and responsibility. None of it was done out of anger. It was done because I understood something I hadn't taken seriously before. I also told him, The next time we spoke, that if they needed help, they would have to ask in advance, at least 2 weeks ahead, and that I would decide based on my own schedule. I'm not always going to be available, I said. There was a pause, shorter this time, and then he said, "All right." That single word sounded different now, smaller than an apology, but larger than an argument. We didn't go back to the way things had been. The calls became less frequent, more intentional. 3 weeks later, Daniel texted me before asking for anything. He wrote, "Mom, are you available next Saturday? Or is that not a good time?" It was a small sentence, but I stared at it for a long moment because it was the first time in years that my time had been treated like it belonged to me. There was space where there hadn't been before, not empty, just no longer filled by expectation. Some evenings, I sit in the living room with my phone beside me, and it stays quiet. I don't reach for it the way I used to, waiting for something to come in that would need to be handled. I don't see it the same way anymore. If you've ever found yourself in a position where your time is treated like it already belongs to someone else, it's worth paying attention to that moment when you realize you can decide differently. For me, that moment didn't fix everything, but it changed enough.